Hello, students, and welcome to Narrative Academy, the series where I can't keep the video type consistent to save my life. Yeah, this series was originally intended to be mostly analysis of existing media, but it turns out I have too much to say to limit it to just that. So now we're doing media analysis and whatever this video ends up being. Learning by example, I guess? Let me hit you with some backstory. A few weeks ago, I got invited out to a local library to give a talk on making webcomics, and one of the questions I got asked afterward was, how do you make a character? And I didn't really know what to say because that's such a huge topic, right? There's a lot you have to consider, and if it doesn't come naturally to you, it can feel overwhelming to even try and get started. So there's that, combined with the fact that in the aftermath of my first Narrative Academy video on Has Been Hotel, I ended up also watching Hell of a Boss and was extremely underwhelmed by the character writing, but I didn't want to dedicate a whole video to talking just about that series, and as a result, an idea was sparked in my head. What if I made a video talking about the entire process of making a character? Not just their visual design, everything from the initial idea to figuring out their personality, their goals, their flaws, how their personality and story impacts their visuals, and how they can make it tie into a larger narrative. It's a big topic, of course, but one I feel pretty confident in my ability to tackle, because if there's one thing I love, it's making characters and telling stories with them. But how exactly would I go about doing that in a way that's interesting? I could just walk through the process of creation for some of my existing characters, but that doesn't quite feel compelling enough. And then I thought, what if I made a completely new character just for this video? And better yet, what if I made it randomized? Generate a character at random and then build on them from there, walking the viewers through the entire development process. So that is what we're going to be doing today. I'll be randomly generating not one, but 3 characters, a full party, and then we'll be fleshing them out into fully realized creations right before your very eyes. We'll be piecing them together over the course of the video and hopefully teaching you all about character creation in the process. Learn from my example, etc., etc. Also, one last thing before we start is that a lot of the questions and tips I'll be considering in this video are taken from the character writing section of my book, How to Webcomic. While a lot of the book is webcomic specific, most of the advice given covers writing and storytelling as a whole, so if you like the information you get from this video and want to see more, maybe go check it out. The link is down in the description, and if you stick around until the end of the video, I'll have a coupon code for you to save a few bucks. So, without further ado, let's get started. Now, the first question we have to ask ourselves is, how are we going to be randomly generating these characters? There's a lot of different character prompt generators online that I could use, but I wanted something a little more tailored to my specific interests. And my interests happen to include tabletop RPGs, like Dungeons & Dragons. So we'll be making randomly generated D&D-esque characters. And before you click off the video, if you don't know anything about D&D and are getting nervous, don't worry, I'll be explaining everything you need to know as we go through the process. So to start, I made a series of randomized tables for each of the main traits of our characters. First up is ancestry. This is basically what type of being you are: human, elf, dwarf, etc. I also had a sub-table for animal hybrids, but spoiler alert, I didn't end up getting to use it, maybe next time. Next up is gender. Pretty self-explanatory, but since I didn't have a 3-sided die, I added a 4th option that's just Star does whatever she wants, assigning your gender based on vibes. The third table is class, which in D&T terms is basically what you bring to the table skills-wise. How do you fight? What are you good at? Can you do magic? And what's your general vibe? Fourth is background, and this one got a little tricky in the planning stage. D&D has a bunch of pre-made backgrounds that give you the basic gist of a character's backstory and impact what skills you're good at, and I basically never use them. Whenever I make a D&D character, I always come up with a custom background for them, but I thought that making some kind of randomized table for a bare-bones backstory would be a fun way to add a bit more to this process. The trouble is that D&D has a lot of pre-made backgrounds, so how could I limit it down to just a handful while still getting a good variety? Well, I ended up going with the selection they used in Baldur's Gate, aka D&D the video game. A nice, interesting range with 12 options to choose from. And lastly, to help with designing their look, I made a final table for their design's main color. This is the vaguest of all the tables, and it's really just meant as a basic springboard for me to jump from when figuring out their overall look. Once I had my tables figured out, it was time to start rolling some dice to build our little guys. And for the record, I re-rolled any duplicates to keep things interesting and avoid potential overlap. Once all the rolls were done, here's what we ended up with. A male dwarven druid with the urchin background and a teal color scheme, a male gnome sorcerer with the artisan background and black is his main color, and a noble tiefling monk with a red color scheme and a gender of my choosing. I've got my work cut out for me here. So let's get into the development process for these fellas, shall we? Let's start with our first character, the dwarf. Cards on the table here, I've never actually made a dwarven character before. They're just not really my vibe, and the aesthetics don't really resonate with me. To be fair, I have recently gained a new appreciation for them, seeing as a very important character in one of my D&D characters' backstories is a dwarf, and I love him so much, but I'm not the type of person who makes a dwarf for her own player character, you know? But right off the bat, we're given some interesting stuff with this guy. Druids are a very nature-oriented class. They can turn into animals, and a lot of their magic is based around the natural world. They're very rooted, in nature, very one with the forest kind of vibes. And that would usually be the route I'd go down here, but the color scheme was throwing me off. Usually, druid makes you think of greens or browns, naturey, woodsy colors, that kind of thing. But this guy's main color had to be teal. And when I thought about what in nature is teal, the first thing that came to my mind was the ocean. Beach-themed druid, anyone? So with that idea in my head, I had a foothold. And then I started looping in the character background. The urchin background in Baldur's Gate 3 says, after surviving a childhood on the streets, you know how to make the most out of very little. And funnily enough, that one sentence actually gives me a lot to work with. The biggest question at the start was, how am I going to get this guy to be a street urchin while also having oceanic hippie energy? Well, that's easy enough. Have him grow up in a seaside city. And if you live by the sea, naturally the people around you are probably going to be fishing. Maybe if he has no food or money, he learns fishing as a method of survival. And eventually he got good at it. Really good. Good enough that he started getting work on fishing boats, heading out to sea and facing the dangers there for food and money to survive. From here, I started thinking that this guy needs some kind of motivation. If he's going to be a protagonist in this hypothetical story, what's his deal? What's his goal? Every good and compelling character needs to have some kind of goal or ambition to drive them forward, so what does this guy want? With that in mind, I started thinking of potential inciting incidents for his personal plotline. Given what we've established so far, the idea of a possible shipwreck in his backstory seemed like an interesting twist, and then I started thinking about how a hypothetical shipwreck could have happened, as well as how it could add to the backstory and present-day motivations. My first thought was that maybe his ship got attacked by some kind of giant sea monster, and he was the only survivor of the attack and has now sworn revenge on the monster that destroyed his boat and killed his allies like a dwarvish Captain Ahab. But that didn't really fit with the keep nature and balance hippie vibes druids typically give off. I also considered maybe the thing that attacked their ship was some kind of hybrid monstrosity made by an evil wizard, and after being the sole survivor of the attack, he then wanted to get revenge on said wizard, but that also didn't feel quite right, so I scrapped that too. I kept thinking druid thoughts, trying to figure out exactly what I could do with this guy, until I stopped focusing on the shipwreck as the key event and made the aftermath the more important focus. Let's say his ship was destroyed in a storm, and as a result, he ended up washed ashore on a deserted island. Thankfully, he knew a bit about survival because he grew up on the streets, but surviving on a deserted island is a lot harder than surviving in a well-populated city. Maybe, while he's there, he makes friends with some kind of creature on the island. It's wary of him at first, but with his gentler vibes and some patience, he's able to befriend the creature, and the creature then helps keep him alive and teach him to survive until he's ultimately rescued. At the time of scripting this, I haven't figured out what kind of creature this would be exactly. Maybe something ethereal and fey-ish, something rare and powerful, but still small or young enough to be interested in befriending people if given the chance. Maybe a baby unicorn or a young sea dragon or something. And after our dwarf gets rescued, he ends up returning to that island over and over again to visit the creature he befriended. So now we've given him some kind of important connection in his life. Let's tear it away. One day, he returns to the island to visit his friend. He has his own boat now and comes back here frequently to see them. But this time, something's different. There are signs that other people have been on this island recently. And that creature he befriended? It's nowhere to be found. Signs point to it being poached or taken by a crew of exotic animal hunters, surely taken to be killed off or sold as a pet to the highest bidder. He wants to save his friend, or failing that, to get revenge on the poachers who stole them away. And now, we have our motivation. Now he has a goal, and that goal will be what drives him forward. I waffled a bit over some design details in the process of figuring out his story. Dwarves in D&D typically live in the mountains or in subterranean tunnels. Following that logic, maybe dwarves don't have a lot of natural UV protection and get sunburned really easily. Maybe his hair and beard have been bleached blonde by being outside in the sun all the time. What kind of clothes would he wear? If he gets burned easily, maybe he tries to stay covered, or wears some kind of big sun hat to keep the sun off his face. Designing his clothes was a little tricky, but I figured some kind of swimsuit cover-up would be a good pick for his upper body. Something lightweight and breathable with long sleeves that cover his arms, but that can be rolled up to keep out of the way while he's gutting a fish, for example. Then I had the idea to go even lower tech and thought, what if he just has a big scrap of fabric that isn't even tailored to be a cover-up, he just has it tied into his belt in such a way that it behaves like a jacket with sleeves. From there, I used a combination of some Pinterest research and my own experience to think about things he'd likely have as a grubby fisherman with no money. I love the look of scrappy D&D characters with a bunch of functional accessories tied to their belts and wanted to lean into that for our guy here. What if he had a little handmade crab trap he could use as a bag to keep his stuff inside? He'd probably have a compass and some fishing implements too. Maybe he keeps tiny little fish bones as makeshift needles or toothpicks and stores them strung up in the band of his hat. And some of those survival bracelets that are actually just really long lengths of emergency rope braided down into bracelets for ease of wear. And of course, all of it is either secondhand or made from scraps or forage, so it'd all have a kind of grungy, worn-out look. His name was one of the last things I figured out, and after a while of waffling, I ended up coming up with his last name first. Seaguard, as in Guardian of the Sea. I figure if he's an orphan, maybe he doesn't have a last name, so he gives himself one. Then I just had to figure out a dwarfy-sounding first name that fit well with his last name, and I eventually settled on Talus. Everybody meet Talus Seaguard. Our second character was the gnome sorcerer, and I'll be honest, gang, this one wasn't really grabbing me, to the point where I sat and struggled to brainstorm details on him until I eventually got annoyed and pushed him aside in favor of our third character. Don't worry, I'll come back to him. So if y'all know me, you know that I love tieflings. Yes, I'm one of those people. If you're unfamiliar, tieflings in D&D are basically half-devils, or their lineage is cursed in some kind of way. More than half the D&D characters I've ever created have been tieflings. They're so versatile and fun to design. I love a character with horns and a tail, and I love that they can be any color I want. Screw what the player's handbook says. I have a goal of someday designing a tiefling for every color of the rainbow. So when I rolled a tiefling as one of my random characters for this video, I was ecstatic. New tiefling for the tiefling pile, huzzah! However, some of you may have already realized the problem. This character was going to be a noble tiefling with a red color scheme, and I already have a noble tiefling with a red color scheme. The dang randomized character tables were just trying to get me to make Emery again. I already have my beloved grumpy red noble tiefling daughter. She can't have competition. So I knew I was going to have to stretch this one a bit. By the way, if you want to see my darling Emery in action, go watch our D&D show What's Left of Us, link in the description, wink. I couldn't change their ancestry or their background, but there wasn't anything saying their main color had to be their skin color. A pretty easy way to beat the Emery copycat allegations would be to just give them a red outfit and make their skin a different color entirely. What color? No idea, we'll sort that out later. That still left me with a monk from a noble background. The noble background is pretty self-explanatory. You're a rich kid from a rich family used to having a higher status. As for the class, in D&D context, monks don't necessarily have to be like meditating under a waterfall style monks. They just have a combat style focused on martial arts, and lots of their abilities focus on hand-to-hand combat. So I started thinking, why would this character be a monk? Why would they choose to fight with their fists instead of some other kind of weapon? If they're nobility, maybe it's a strategic move. They don't want people to think they're dangerous, so they don't carry weapons. But they actually use their entire body as a weapon, so even if they're unarmed, they can still defend themselves in a fight. And then I started thinking about that mindset with a potential fist-fighting martial artist. Even if you have no weapons, you will always have your own body. Make yourself into a weapon, and you'll never be unarmed. But that led me down a bit of a strange path. This character would be fighting with nothing but their fists. Fighting with nothing. A noble that has nothing. Worthless nobility? There's something there, I can feel it. I started softballing ideas around. Maybe this character is a low-ranking noble, the youngest child of a noble family who has next to no hope of ever inheriting anything. Or what if we go lower? The adopted child of a noble family who has no legitimate claim to anything, even in the chance the rest of their family bit the dust. But let's make it even worse. Maybe this kid is the illegitimate son of the head of the household, but as a way to keep his mother quiet and avoid a huge public scandal, they cover it up by saying that they adopted this random orphan child out of the goodness of their hearts. Like, yes, look how kind and generous we are, adopting this poor abandoned child off the streets and taking them into our home. Lavish praise upon us fellow nobles for our philanthropy, and smile for the camera, worthless child, we can't let people know that you're a scandal baby. They're treated well when eyes are on them, but behind closed doors, this kid is basically treated like a servant in slightly nicer clothes. In fact, they're so worthless to this family, it even reflects in their name, Nyx, which, if you didn't know, is Latin for nothing. Yeesh. By this point, I was settled on making them a male character. While I already have 2 other male characters in the party, and I did bounce around the idea of making them a girl for a bit, I was ultimately convinced to go male for reasons I'll go into later. So this character, Nyx, begrudgingly adopted into this family that treats him like nothing and basically only takes care of him to avoid his birth mother leaking the affair to the press. They refuse to teach him any kind of weapons or magic, so he won't have any fantasies of retaliating against them. In response, he learns martial arts. Even if I have no weapons, I can still be dangerous and worthy of respect. I'll make them respect me. But I wanted to figure out exactly where he learned fighting from, and had the thought that maybe one of the family's guards teaches him. It went against the family's rules, but the guards could obviously see the poor treatment Nyx was getting behind closed doors, and I imagine at some point one of them took pity on him. Maybe at first it was just a form of exercise so Nyx could get some frustration out, but he ended up taking to it really quickly, and pretty soon he could hold his own against most of the family guards. Of course, this all had to be done in secret so the rest of the family wouldn't find out, but eventually, somehow, they did, and that first guard takes the full blame for it, losing their job and getting forced out of the family's employment. In response to the closest thing he has to a friend getting kicked out for his act of kindness, Nyx decides he's finally had enough, and after years of his adopted family's mistreatment, in the dead of night, he runs away from home, determined to get out of the shadow of his family, make his former teacher proud, and become something instead of nothing. And as one last FU to his family, he changes the spelling of his name from N-I-X to N-Y-X, the Latin word for night. Nyx's character was the one whose story came together the easiest, but his design was where I really struggled. I knew I didn't want the red to be his skin color, but once I figured out his name, I thought a deep gray would be an interesting choice. This may or may not have been partially inspired by seeing screenshots of my friend's Final Fantasy XIV character the night I did a bulk of my brainstorming for this video. I also don't have a gray tiefling on my current roster, so that's one more color checked off my list. From there, I tried to figure out what kind of clothes would suit him. I at first tried mixing the style of European noble clothing with more Eastern-inspired martial arts clothes, but decided to ditch the nobility clothing idea since, well, Nyx wanted to get as far away from his family's influence as possible. Why would he still be wearing their clothes? The final outfit design came from doing some skimming on Pinterest looking for inspiration, and I ended up falling in love with the sort of asymmetrical off-the-shoulder robe look I saw in a few designs. I thought it added a bit of an unbalanced and chaotic energy to his appearance and let him show off the gun show a little bit. I actually really struggled with figuring out his horn and hair situation. I wanted something sharp and pointy that didn't overlap with any of my other tiefling designs and ended up going with the curved backwards look. Simple but effective. And anything larger would have made him seem more intimidating, which I didn't really want. See, over the course of my design brainstorming, I figured out some more of his personality. Being treated like he was worthless for his entire life made him dream of independence and not living in his family's shadow, so when he finally gets out of it, he expresses his freedom in a very rebellious teen sort of way. He chops his hair short and dyes streaks into it. He opts for more loose and comfortable clothes rather than the tight and stuffy outfits he wore as a noble. And he wants to be seen as this cool and intimidating presence so badly, but he's still young enough that he's pretty short and scrawny despite being the muscle of his team. And because he's so young, he gets easily frustrated and flustered when people bring this up. He's a talented fighter, but he has a lot of growing to do in more ways than one. I also wanted to make him short because his other two party members are a dwarf and a gnome, so he'd be paired with these two shorties for their entire adventure. But if he's paired with these other shorter party members, he still looks tall in comparison to them, and that mental image gave me so many feelings and was the first step on the path that ultimately led to very cute found family vibes. But before we get into that, we have to figure out this dang gnome. So let's circle back to our last character. I put halfling and gnome in the same square for the ancestry table because design-wise they're fairly similar. Halflings are basically just hobbits and gnomes feel like little guys with silly vibes. Like our first character, I've also never made a halfling or a gnome, so I didn't have any previous experiences or biases to build off of. And I've also never made a sorcerer either. D&D has several magic-based classes, and each one gets access to magic in different ways. Clerics get magic from the god they worship, bards get magic by playing a little toot on the flute, and wizards study in the art of the arcane and get their magic through learning. Sorcerers, though, typically get magic either from their bloodline, or it's thrust upon them later in life somehow. The thing about sorcerers, though, is that they're called charisma casters. They rely on their charisma score for their spell casting. The higher their charisma stat is, the more powerful their spells will be. So if you're playing a sorcerer, you'll want their charisma to be pretty high. So I started thinking about that. A very sociable and charismatic character. How do we mix that in with the rest of what we got to work with? Let's take a look at his background. Artisan. Your skill in a particular craft has earned you membership in a mercantile guild, offering privileges and protection while engaging in your art. Okay, so he's a craftsman of some kind. When I put that together with the idea of a charismatic magic user, maybe he was some kind of inventor? And his motivation for adventuring could be gathering inspiration for his next invention. Maybe he's a bit washed up. He's on the older side, hasn't had any spectacular ideas in a while, and he's looking for that big idea that'll finally get his name out there. That was something I could work with. I kept bouncing ideas around. Maybe we could tie in the black color scheme with him always being very nicely dressed. The guy is always wearing a suit in case he bumps into someone fancy he can pitch his newest invention to. Maybe he's used to pitching himself constantly to try and get investors. If he needed money, maybe he pitched himself to some nobility that liked his vibe and became his patrons, giving him money in exchange for him building things for them. I was really happy with the vibes I had at this point until I realized I didn't really have a sorcerer. I had accidentally made an artificer instead. This guy had magic. He's supposed to be a sorcerer. Magic needed to be part of his deal somehow. But how could I squeeze that in? While brainstorming, one of my mods suggested looking at the different sorcerer subclasses for inspiration. Each D&D class also has subclasses, which basically lets you get more specific with the types of skills you have and how you use them, both in combat and outside of it. My mod suggested Clockwork Soul might be an interesting option for our gnome here. Clockwork Soul sorcerers are basically given magic by their connection to living machinery. Their magic is flavored with steampunk vibes and a focus on balance and order. And while I did think there was potential there, it didn't really seem right for this guy. The vibes were off, but what were the other subclasses? I looked around and none of them really stuck out to me. Aberrant Mind for a psychic-flavored spellcaster, no. Draconic Bloodline for a powerful ancestor and elemental spells, no, not that either. Until I saw, at the very bottom of the list, Wild Magic. Wild Magic sorcerers are a very interesting subclass. The basic gist is that you've obtained this magic somehow, but it's very chaotic and hard to control. And sometimes when you cast a spell, there will be some kind of random side effect. This can be a positive thing, like suddenly you and your allies all get healed a little bit for free, or it can set you on fire, or turn you into a potted plant. It's complete chaos, and it was perfect. From there, his story just naturally fell into place. I decided that he was born into a poor family, but he always had a knack for inventing things and was always trying to come up with new ways to make the lives of his family members easier. He kept it up, always trying to invent new things, and had aspirations of someday coming up with his magnum opus, his grand design for an invention that would improve the lives of the entire world. However, he didn't really have the money to travel, and instead, once he came of age, pitched himself to a rich family. He'd be their in-house inventor and problem solver in exchange for them paying him. Which they did, handsomely. And while he was making very good money working for this family, he also wasn't feeling especially challenged. The things they asked him to invent were always so pedestrian, so simple, so boring. At some point, he started fiddling with a design in his free time, a portal that would allow people to traverse the world easily without relying on complicated teleportation magic unavailable to most civilians. He worked for months on this device, slaving over its design between jobs from his patrons, and when it finally came time to test it, it exploded. It leveled the wing of the house he had been working in, and although our gnomish friend luckily survived, the explosion left him different, marked with magic from his botched extraplanar experiment. The rich family he worked for fired him, but he thankfully had enough in savings to live comfortably for a while. But with his newfound freedom, he returns to his original goal, an invention that would help every person in the world. But despite his grand ambitions, he's still somewhat sheltered, having lived in the same city his entire life. And so he sets off to travel, learning more about the needs of the people the world over and vowing to bring his talents to them as he goes, making a bit of coin in the process and hopefully figuring out how his newfound magic can be harnessed for good. I love this guy. The one I had the most trouble with initially was shaping up to be a really interesting character. I kept brainstorming more aspects of his personality. His high charisma and his job as an inventor made me think he could be some kind of showman, complete with a fancy suit and a fantasy transatlantic accent. Maybe he's very good at first impressions, but his flaw could be that he doesn't know when to take no for an answer. He's a bit stubborn and pushy and will keep trying to sell himself and his ideas until he eventually annoys his potential customers. Additionally, one aspect wild magic sorcerers have is a subtle luck theme. Some of their skills center around it, and there's also an optional skill or feat in D&D called Luck, which allows you to turn the tides in your favor. He was lucky to survive the explosion and lucky to have gotten magic from it seemingly for free. And now you too, dear audience member, have found yourself in the lucky position of meeting such a man. Come, let's exchange a gentlemanly greeting in the form of a handshake. Maybe some of my luck will rub off on you, eh? He says. I really fell in love with this idea and had a good vibe in mind for him, but he still needed a name. I started looking up names that mean lucky and saw the name Penny on a list. Gnomes usually have pretty quirky multi-part names, so maybe his surname could be Penny something? Pennyworth? Pennyshine? Pennybrook. A river of luck. I then started looking for first names with the same meaning and struggled for a bit. I considered Felix for a moment, but I actually already have another character named Felix. Yes, she's a tiefling, leave me alone. I threw around a few more ideas. Chance, Clover, Fortunato, Ace, but the one that stuck out to me was Asher, Ash for short. I was actually considering something similar as a name for our tiefling character before coming up with Nyx, so seeing that name pop up on a list of luck-themed names seemed auspicious. And so, we had our name. Asher Pennybrook, Gnomish Inventor Extraordinaire. As for his visual design, I didn't have to do many drafts before I had one I was satisfied with. After doing all of his story brainstorming, I already had a pretty clear vision in my head, and from there it was just a matter of getting it onto paper. I knew I wanted him to have a mustache and a fancy black suit with gold trim, but I also ended up giving him a little Lucky Clover ascot pin as a fun little detail. So, without further ado, here's Asher. So, after all that work, here's our lineup. Talus Seaguard, the ocean-focused protector of nature. Nyx, a runaway tiefling who wants out of their family's shadow and to carve their own place in the world. And Asher, an ambitious, smooth-talking inventor who wants to improve the lives of every citizen. We've got some good groundwork laid for our party, but we still need to flesh them out a little bit more. We figured them out as individuals, but how do they work together as a party? If you're writing a story with an ensemble cast, you'll definitely want to figure out how each character interacts with each other. Consider their similarities as well as their differences. What do they agree on? What would they fight over? How do they each approach the same problem, and how do their goals interact? Do they make up for each other's flaws? Do they rely on each other in some kind of way? And how might their relationships evolve over time? So let's get into the nitty-gritty with these guys. What are their dynamics like, and how do we figure that out? First, let's consider how each character might interact with each other. We can start with Talus and Nyx. They both had hard lives, but had very different upbringings. Talus was a street urchin and had to fend for himself. It made him very self-sufficient and independent, but he never had a family to call his own. Meanwhile, Nyx was raised in the nobility. He was brought up by a rich family, and although it definitely wasn't sunshine and roses, he at least had a roof over his head and didn't go hungry. Maybe this is something they fight about. When Talus learns that Nyx ran away from home, he'd try to convince Nyx to return to them, saying that he's lucky to have a family at all, and that he should treasure them despite their flaws. And then Nyx can shoot back, "Sure, they raised me, but they aren't my family. I was worth less than dirt to them. My mother didn't want me and forced my father's family to raise me, and they only did it to avoid a scandal. I'm better off without them, and I'm going to show them that I'm not worthless." This fight could be a bonding moment between them and helps them to see each other in a new light. Meanwhile, what about Nyx and Asher? Since I imagine Asher to be on the older side, I think maybe he sees this troubled teen tiefling and decides to take him under his wing. Nyx doesn't care for him much at first. Like many people, maybe he sees Asher as pushy and annoying with his flashy showmanship. But in time, he starts warming up to this guy who genuinely wants to help make his life better with no ulterior motives. Maybe Asher is a bit like the dad Nyx never had. Lastly, what about Asher and Talus? This one was a little bit tricky for me until I started to think about what Talus could bring to the table. The stereotype with druids is that they spend all their time out in nature, so they aren't as good at reading social situations. But maybe, let's invert that. Talus has spent his life having to use his insight to survive. And while he got to know animals especially well, aren't all people just animals at their core? Just like how you can lure an animal into a trap with food, if you can figure out what people want, you can predict them just as easily. Sure, he might not have as polished an understanding of social conventions as Asher would, but he's insightful, empathetic, and extremely good at reading people and understanding their motivations. While Asher's the face of his party with all the charisma in the world, maybe Talus is the one who's actually good at reading people, judging their wants and intents, and guiding Asher from just outside the spotlight. Maybe he even shapeshifts into some kind of small animal and sits on Asher's shoulder during important conversations to subtly guide him through tense negotiations. A contrasting but interesting dynamic. And circling back, I said there was a reason I chose to make Nyx a guy. The truth is, I sort of fell in love with this weird little found family dynamic that these three settled into. A troubled teen tiefling and his weird adopted dads. A strange trio, but they make it work and they make each other better in the process. Just guys being dudes and doing their best to survive and asking their weird little adopted son to get things off the top shelf for them. There's a lot more that I could write about these characters. In fact, pretty much everything I've written came together over the course of a single evening of brainstorming. If given more time to flesh out these characters, I'm sure I could piece together a pretty interesting story with them. And in fact, I'm willing to bet you might have some ideas for them as well. But the focus for today's lesson was in simply crafting the characters, and how setting up your cast in an effective way can spark ideas on how their story will flow outwards from them. Where will their adventures take them from here? I have a few ideas. Maybe I'll make some sort of follow-up video going into how to craft a storyline. Let me know in the comments if that's something you guys are interested in, and if this video sparked any ideas on challenges these characters could face in their story together, I'd love to hear those in the comments as well. So before we wrap up here, let's do a bit of a recap. When writing individual characters, you'll want to ask yourself questions. What is their goal? What's their ambition? What did they want? And why do they want it? Once you've figured out that goal, you should decide how they're going to go about chasing it. What happens if they get it? What happens if they don't? What's standing in their way? And how do those goals mesh or clash against the goals of their allies and enemies? You should also think about the positives and negatives with each character. Everyone's good at something, but in contrast, everyone has their weaknesses as well. What is your character good at? What's their specialty? Is there anything they wish they were better at? What's their weakness? What are they afraid of? How do they handle being confronted by their weaknesses? What about this character might annoy other people? How easily does this character make allies or enemies? Who are their friends and who are their foes? Additionally, if you're planning an ensemble cast, consider how your characters will interact with each other. Where do they agree on things? Where do they disagree? What do they fight over? And how do they resolve conflict when it arises? How do their goals mesh or contrast with each other? What do they have in common? Where do they differ? And how can they work to overcome those differences? Asking yourself these types of questions is one of the best ways to flesh out your characters and make them feel like real living people. It's easy to make a one-dimensional character who just exists to look cool and say cool things. But if you're willing to put in the extra work to really flesh them out, the final product will be that much more compelling. Go forth, friends, and make yourself some cool little guys. I'll be cheering you on from here. So that's about it for this video, but before we go, it's time for Star's Webcomic Corner! The segment where I recommend some of my favorite stories, boost my fellow creators, and hopefully give you guys something new and cool to read. My recommendation for this video is one I just read for the first time recently, and I think it fits with the tone of this video. So, without further ado... Magic is a tricky thing. Sometimes spells are simple. A little bit of telekinesis here, a little bit of sparkle there. But then you try something a little bigger, a little bolder, and you wind up somewhere you don't expect. Tales from Alderwood is a fantasy comic starring Catherine, a plucky young mage trying to teach herself spellcasting. However, when her botched teleportation spell lands her in the middle of a famous artificer's house, she assumes she'll be dragged to jail, but ends up with a job instead. And while things may seem simple and fun at first, it slowly becomes clear that there's something a little deeper and a little darker going on under the surface. This comic is one I read for the first time pretty recently, but I enjoyed it so much I'm actually annoyed I didn't read it sooner. It's very well crafted from a storytelling standpoint. The story obviously takes a lot of inspiration from fantasy games like D&D, but with a lot of the writer's own world building and magic system lore added in. And the art is top-notch as well. The characters are expressive, the backgrounds are gorgeous, and I was hooked within just the first few pages. And as an added bonus, it manages to be genuinely sweet and heartfelt at times, while being pretty tense and ominous during others, but on top of it all, it's genuinely hilarious. I laughed out loud dozens of times going through the archive, both from the art and the writing. If you enjoy fantasy series, this is one I can very highly recommend. If you'd like to check out the comic, you can read the full series for free on the website, as well as on multiple platforms. Links for all of those will be down in the description, so I hope you all check it out. Alright friends, that'll do it for this episode. As a reminder, if you enjoyed the advice I offered in this video, I have an entire book called How to Webcomic that'll teach you all of my best writing and drawing advice. It's aimed at webcomic creators, but a lot of the advice is applicable to all kinds of creative fields, and I've gotten some really positive feedback on how the book has helped people improve their character and story writing. The link is down in the description if you'd like to check it out, and as thanks for sticking around to the end, use code CHARACTER to get 10% off the book until the end of the month. Additionally, while the characters I made here were specifically for this video, I'll remind you all that I also have an entire free-to-read webcomic called Cast Off, with a bunch more fun characters for you to sink your teeth into. Who knows, maybe the trio from this video will make a cameo someday. If you'd like to check it out, the link is down in the description. And of course, as always, I'd like to thank my wonderful patrons who help make these videos possible, especially my video shout-out tier patrons. Mr. Danmatsu, Holly, and Jared. Thank you for giving me an excuse to come up with even more tieflings for my tiefling horde. Patrons not only get their name in the credits of all my videos, they also get early access to videos and cast-off pages, exclusive physical rewards, and a bunch more. If you'd like to join them, you can find my Patreon at patreon.com/castoff. Link is down in the description. Alright, and that'll be it for today's installment. Thank you for joining us for Narrative Academy. Class dismissed.